And welcome back. As we go ahead and continue working with building out our game, let's go ahead and work on our next animation. We already have our kind of our idle animations in here, but let's go ahead and look at our sprite, and we're going to actually pull this up using our sprite editor just to take a look at this, and we can see what are our sprites that are going to be kind of our walking animation. And you can notice we have a couple different things in here that we can use that can kind of work with that. So for example, I want to do a walking animation. I might say, I'm going to use these 3 frames, we're going to use these 4 frames, but let's just say we do these 4 frames of animation. So that's hero 0 through hero 3, and so we're going to use those as kind of our formation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open that up, and I'm going to click on hero 0, and I'm going to go ahead and click, grab up to hero 3. And just like before, we're going to go ahead and right click on these, and we're going to create a animation. And it's going to say we got a new animation here, and so we'll call this player walk. And just like that, we have our player walk animation, and I'm going to actually drag that over into my animations folder just like before. And if we look at our player animation here, we can kind of see the different frames of movement that it's going to be cycling through. So let's switch over to our animator here. And of course, if you look before, we only had just our player idle. So let's add our player walk animation into there. And I'm going to scooch this up just a little bit so we can see just a little bit more. And we want to connect this in here because we're going to go from our idle animation into our walk. And so I'm going to click on player idle. I'm going to right click. I'm going to choose to make a transition. Make a transition allows the game to say, hey, I want to go from one state to another. You can see I get this arrow that's saying, where do we want to go to? Well, we want to go to the player walk. So I'm going to click on player walk. And now when I click on player walk, you can see it's attached to the player idle. And so now we can, of course, actually look at what transitions are we actually trying to put in here. So if I click back on where this arrow is, you can see we get a bunch of different settings that we now have control over. Now I'm going to go ahead and take my preview and I'm going to shrink that down here because I don't need that open right now. Instead, I'm going to focus on my settings. And so if I open up settings, you can see we have a bunch of different things in here. Now, what this transitions technically do is it allows the game to kind of move from one set of animation to another, but we don't want this here in our 2D sprite. We want it to immediately snap from one animation to another. So I'm going to first take my exit time and change that down to 0, as well as the transition time, and make that 0 as well. And I'm also going to uncheck this has exit time, because what this does is it forces it to complete an animation cycle. So for example, if we were in idle, it's going to play through that full animation for idle before we actually have our character move into its walk animation. So we don't want that checked here. This is better for when we have like one-off animations kind of thing, like if you're doing like a victory pose or something like that. So we're just going to uncheck that, and notice we now have a little warning here that says we need a condition or an exit time to be valid. Now, to go ahead and again, to make this happen, we need to add some parameters here. Because it says it needs a condition. Well, condition can be controlled by parameters. And we can do this by hitting the plus sign here. And we have options. We have floats, ints, bools, and triggers. The thing we want right now is a bool, which if you remember is just simply a true or false. So we can say like is walking. All right, and that would allow us to say, hey, the player is walking. And if I go ahead and click on my player idle here or my player walk, you can see our lists are currently we have one transition set up in here, but in this one, the transition is listed as empty for the player walk. So to add this is walking, let's go ahead and click on our transition again. And in here, our list is empty, so let's go ahead and add our is walking is true. You can see that warning has now gone away. And I'm now going to go to player walk, right click and make a transition. And I'm going to have the arrow point back to the player idle. So I go ahead and click on player idle. And so you see now I have an arrow that's pointing down to player walk, an arrow that's pointing back to player idle. Now, just like we had done our tweaks here to this transition, we need, of course, need to modify this transition. So go ahead, pause the video. I'm going to give you a micro challenge here. Go ahead and see what settings do we need to change so we can have this move from the player walk back into player idle. All right, so of course, you probably recognize we have a couple things. We need to uncheck our has exit time. All right, in fact, I'm going to make sure I clear that out first, so make sure that's 0. I'm going to set my transition also down to 0, and I'm going to go to my conditions and add in the is walking, but we want to make sure that is set to false now, because in this state, we aren't moving the character, so this would be false. So now let's go ahead and take a look at how these are actually working in the game. So I'm going to go ahead and start my game, but before I do that, let's just make sure we've looped our walking animation here, because we don't want that to be a one-off. And so if we go ahead and start up our game, we, of course, are right now in our idle animation. But if I go ahead and hit this check mark on is walking, we, of course, should be able to see this character change into our walking animation. Now, I notice he seems to be moving really, really fast here, so I might want to change the speed. This might be good for a running animation, but it's a little too fast for walking. So I'm actually going to go to my player walk and adjust that, because I want to adjust the speed of that player walk. And so in here, we can, of course, adjust that speed. You see right now it's set to 1. Maybe I'm going to set that to 0.5. I'm going to slow him down just a little bit here. So if we go ahead and rerun that, and let's go ahead and check our is walking here. You can see now he's moving at a pretty brisk pace, but that seems a lot more reasonable than the running that we had before. Alright, so now I'm going to present with you two different challenges. The first thing I'm going to challenge you with is we have our player walk set up. What's if we wanted a player run? Now this one should be a pretty easy challenge that we can do. And the other thing I want you to challenge with, which is going to be a little bit harder, is to go ahead and create your climbing animation. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and when we come back, I'm not going to walk you through the whole thing, but I will show you our kind of our end product here with those two different animations. Alright, and so now I've gone ahead and added these three states in here. So if we go ahead and take a look at how these are working within our game world, we of course have our idle state, we have our is walking here, I have my is running, so we're moving really quickly. We have our climbing animation. Of course, those were pretty easy to set up. The running animation, of course, is simply just the exact same as our walking animation. In fact, I was able just to duplicate that and then just had to adjust the transitions for that. And then the climbing animation, all I had to do for that was create the animation out of the appropriate character sprites here. So I did use Hero 21 and 22 to go ahead and create that. And so once that was done, I created the appropriate animation in here, dragged it all in, marked it in, set our transitions accordingly. Remember, of course, our settings for all these were set to 0 all the way through and having no exit time. And you can see I have the appropriate conditions marked for each: is walking, is running, and is climbing. So that's our challenge there, and with a couple little peek of how everything should look. But when we come back next time, we're going to, of course, be building on this, and before long, we're going to also need some code so we can have this be handled automatically instead of having to sit here and click these little buttons to toggle those inputs.